Okay, so I'm going to thank you very much, Goldsmiths and students of Goldsmiths, for having me all these years. And yeah, I'm going to actually present some research, a talk based on research that I did a few years back. Kind of after the financial crisis, and during a period in which there was more and more interest in cybernetics and its impact on art and the kind of relationship between cybernetics and contemporary artistic practice, lead to artistic practice against the war. So it will become clear, as in the talk, what cybernetics is and what the relationship might be to some extent. Because it's quite a long text that I'm drawing on here. It was published in a New Magazine in Art and Education, E+ publication online. I think I should just sort of crack on with it. And at the end, if any of it is massively opaque, or there's questions about any of the kind of empirical stuff that's discussed, maybe that can be brought up, and I'll try and clarify any points. But yeah, so just trying to get straight into the talk. It's called Short Circuits, Finance, Feedback, and Culture. I could give a précis, but it's really about finance, feedback, and culture. So, that's it. And without further ado, start with a quotation. There is no such thing as an empty space or an empty time. There is always something to see, something to hear. So said John Cage in his 1958 lecture, Experimental Music. John Cage, I guess everyone here will be familiar with as a composer, post-war American composer. This talk argues that the aesthetic or cultural transformation of absence into presence, the revelation by subtraction of new raw materials or free inputs, bears a relation to the logic of accumulation in an era of financialized capitalist self-cannibalization. All of that will be unpacked, don't worry. What Cage valorized in the aesthetic sphere, developing concepts of feedback and self-regulation formulated in cybernetics, anticipated the innovations of modern finance and the production by subtraction of empty/full spaces of accumulation. So we could say, maybe a bit more simply, that art anticipated finance and the contemporary mode of accumulation of capital as a whole. So starting off with one of the terms from the title, feedback. What is feedback? The term feedback originates from the interdisciplinary science of cybernetics. Cybernetics is concerned with regulation within closed systems. It looks for and exploits circular causal relationships, feedback, within these systems. Negative feedback is a process in which action and its effects are fed back to the actor in order to better coordinate aim and result. The loop proceeds from action, so for example, firing a machine gun at an enemy plane in order to shoot it down, to sensing how is the target affected, to comparison with the desired goal, has the plane been shot down, to action, shoot again, a degree to the right, and so on. So you've got this kind of feedback loop. Yeah? Action, result, next action. And rather than just repeating the same old action, you can modify, regulate that action. In this case, the shooting. Shoot, miss, shoot again, right? Fell again, fell better. So anyway, we'll get to that. The Beckettian mechanics of cybernetics. But anyway, so you've got the feedback loop. The circle of action, monitoring, correction, and further action integrates error in order to regulate and improve performance. Incorporating indeterminacy and recursive logic enables an automation and expansion of control. So it's not just a randomness and error and contingency are opposed to control, but rather the former is integrated into it. On the other hand, as we'll see, this virtuous circle of negative feedback can also invert into its opposite, i.e. positive feedback. From the perspective of control, that's not positive at all, but represents a spiraling disorder or perturbation of the system, a vicious circle. So the confusing thing is cybernetics says, what did they say? They say negative feedback for that kind of condition of correcting and improving a system's function by feeding back information. You think positive feedback would be the good thing, but it's not. It's when things start to go wrong in terms of that system of control. But we'll come back to this. So it's no accident that the circular causality of the feedback loop resembles the cycle of capital accumulation described by Karl Marx, the philosopher, theorist, the critic of political economy, whatever. So this cycle of capital accumulation is money, commodity, more money, money prime. No accident that resembles the feedback loop. Information feedback has played an increasingly important role in the larger loop of capital accumulation for decades, if not centuries. The cybernetic revolution simply radicalizes solutions to capitalist crisis proposed by Ford, Taylor, and Keynes, expanding the ambit of control by flattening the world into a single dimension of information. I hope we can unpack some of this if it's too grand or not sufficiently explained. But as Tikkun claimed in their essay, The Cybernetic Hypothesis, the internet has become a global cybernetic system, enabling capital to manipulate and monitor consumer preferences. Consumer behaviour, for example, is subject to the management of financial markets. Quote, each actor in capitalist valorization is a real-time backup of quasi-permanent feedback loops. Unquote. We may disagree that the information society has brought about a new form of value creation, although people do argue that, in which information is wealth. Nevertheless, the rise of the information society certainly coincides with the installation everywhere of feedback loops which monitor and regulate consumption, production, and distribution. Capital strains to reduce its overheads by outsourcing labour to consumers. Witness the rise of social networking for a very obvious and inescapable example, and subjects all social processes to measurement and quantification. Through privatisation, marketisation, and the destruction of earlier modes of welfare, society is subsumed under the commodity form. Like good students of cybernetics, the new Labour government set about installing forms of performance measurement and modification across the public sector, primarily in health and education, imposing value as a dominant metaphor on all areas of social reproduction. This indexed the need to generate growth, no doubt, to find substitutes for industrial production in decline, and to increase the pressure on workers of all kinds. The deepening penetration of informational feedback loops contributes to an extension of the working day and a breakdown of limits to exploitation. The, quote, efficiency of this process was predicated on another order of feedback, however, the continued rise of the UK as a global centre for the creation and retail of fictitious capital, say finance capital, broadly. The production of a specific form of, quote, information, credit and debt is crucial. The UK's health and education sectors, not to mention the UK's other unproductive services, could only deliver a facsimile of growth in relation to the city's siphoning off of the global value product. I mean, this is covering a lot of ground, but the idea being that all of these things do evidence forms of cybernetic feedback, specifically in the financial sphere, but also as a kind of metaphor that is put into practice in spheres like education and health. To understand the larger feedback loop in which the circuits of, quote, information society, as it's known, function, then we need to look at the feedback loops of finance capital. An increasingly large proportion of this information represents claims on non-existent value, so credit and debt, as well as a plethora of financial instruments like derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, and so on, that dominate the global finance market. In this process, information does indeed become hegemonic, not as value, but as fictitious capital. So I'm sort of trying to say that, you know, finance really is crucially important, and it really is a form of informational control, self-regulation, and feedback. But it's not necessarily the value that it claims to be. It's a kind of fine and, you know, a point with lots of ramifications, but maybe we can come back to that later, because that's another order of exposition, another order of complexity. Anyway, just to continue. So in this process, information becomes hegemonic, not as value, but as fictitious capital. This does not amount to an actual process of valorization, value production in Marxian terms. Merely the ever-increasing generation of claims on future, as yet non-existent, or no longer existent value. So in short, you know, we get massive financial bubbles, we get massive mountains of finance, that have created financial information, digital information in the end. But that doesn't necessarily refer to an actual underlying value, to use Marx's distinction between the appearance and the reality, right? In order for these claims on value to be made good, supported and sustained, an anterior process of valorization and expropriation remains necessary. So there still has to be exploitation, people still have to work, etc., to make good all of this fictitious capital. As in Marx's day, there remains no substitute for the expenditure of human labour in the creation of value. So, I mean, sort of now goes into explaining fictitious capital a bit more. It will come back to art and music and nice things. Fictitious capital comes to function as a kind of effective but precarious surrogate for value, which both depends on and is undone by financial feedback loops that constitute it. In David McNally's 2008 essay, From Financial Crisis to World Slump, he describes how the becoming pervasive of value as the form of measurement of all social activity coincides precisely with its becoming tenuous and volatile as a measure of value. Its absolute triumph is predicated on its increasing shakiness as a claim. McNally writes, with the end of dollar-gold convertibility in 1971 and the move to floating exchange rates, rates that literally fluctuate all day, each and every day, according to values determined on world markets, currency values, especially for the dollar, became much more volatile. As a result, the formation of values at the world level became much more uncertain and less predictable. So, maybe you need some unpacking. The growth of finance is predicated on an actual decommodification of world money, right? To put it another way, the commodification of everything else stems from the decommodification of the dollar as global reserve currency. So in 1971, basically, the dollar continues to be the currency that's used for international trade, but it no longer trades against an actual commodity value, right? So many bars of gold behind all of those dollars ceases to be the case. It floats free of that. That's the crucial point here, and that will come back into the art and music, etc. So this decommodification, this commodification of everything is related to this decommodification of money. The measure of value property of money, money's use as a measure of value, the capacity of money to express the socially necessary abstract labour times inherent in commodities was rendered highly unstable, says McNally. So if you're a Marxist, and even if you're not Marxist, it doesn't matter, it's just the case, that the value of commodities depends on labour. It's measured in labour. The amount of time it takes to make something, and the amount of time over and above the time it takes to make something and reproduce the work that makes it is surplus value. That hasn't changed, but this is no longer expressed in the thing that we use to express value, i.e. money. All over the world, money is flying around, but it's lost that reference. It's lost, which it should be a familiar idea, right? The loss of reference. This is the postmodern condition as described by many different thinkers. But so the Marxist version sees that as related to a sort of evolution in the productivity of labour and the way the money works. The suspension of value as a measure is paradoxically but logically expressed in a new overaccumulation of forms of measurement, beginning with those most influential forms of measure, the financial instruments called derivatives. So because of this volatilization, new kinds of finance start to proliferate and become more important. In essence, derivatives set out to measure and price risk. I guess people will have heard this term many times by now, but derivatives are a kind of exemplary example of the new kinds of money-like finance, money-like instruments. In essence, derivatives set out to measure and price risk, as McNally says in his essay. The increased uncertainty of value relations puts an increased emphasis on risk assessment and monitoring for all capitalists, but especially those who in a globalized market have to deploy multiple currencies. These currencies themselves become more volatile because of the suspension of dollar-gold convertibility. The basic loop of financialization is thus a movement from the suspension of dollar-gold convertibility, and the dollar stands for gold, for actual commodity value, the suspension of dollar-gold convertibility to the increasing volatility of currencies, to the proliferation of mechanisms, derivative contracts, for monitoring and ensuring against these fluctuations. Right? So you lose a global standard of value that's rooted in labour, You get more volatility, more fluctuation between all the currencies. Currencies are more and more important because trade is globalized and production is globalized. And in order to deal with that fluctuation and that volatility, you use more and more financial derivatives, these contracts that will help you sort of secure your investments and to make your investments pay, right? I can unpack this further later if needed. But so yeah, so we have more and more of that. But a further cybernetic spiral, and this, you know, remembering back to this idea of feedback, because that is a feedback loop, right? From I mean, the reason that the dollar ceases to be backed by gold is itself a response to a crisis, to the problem of increasing productivity of labour. It then generates a solution of suspension of the dollar and its direct relation to labour. And then that produces further solutions, right? There are further problems, i.e. volatility, and further solutions, derivatives. But I would go on a further twist is that these themselves then become a problem. Further cybernetic spiral immediately arises from the growth of derivatives as risk measure and hedge, security or insurance against risk. Derivatives become themselves a source of risk, and anyone who remembers back to 2008 will perhaps now recall much talk of derivatives and massive systemic crisis. Because one can buy insurance against risks to assets one doesn't actually own. Derivatives can function instead as a form of financial speculation. So the insurance policies were used as gambling chips, if you like, and are to this day, in fact even more now. Derivatives become a source of form of financial speculation. For instance, a credit default swap, which is another kind of financial contract or instrument. A credit default swap against a risk of General Motors defaulting can be purchased even if one owns no General Motors stock or bonds. Speculators can win by shorting the circuits of value they feed on. Right? So again, you've got a cybernetic cybernetic loop going on here that can be exploited. Ooh, sorry, let's kill that. Whether gambling on currency movements or exploiting value gaps between markets, which is known as arbitrage or arbitrage, the same logic applies. Tools originally conceived as a way to measure and so more precisely price risk and therefore master volatility become themselves a source of fluctuations in prices as their use en masse gives rise to new forms of financial feedback, as well as impacting on the material world immediately through the devaluation of currencies and drastic price changes. The diffusion and networking of risk enabled by derivatives displaces risk from the local to the systemic level. The virtuous circle, negative feedback, going back to the beginning of the talk, of debt creation, becomes ever more likely to invert into a vicious circle, positive feedback, of depreciation, so destruction of values. Guaranteed returns based on risk-managed revenue streams prove to be fictitious. I don't know if that's all too much, or anyway, I'll keep going. There isn't space here to properly go into the workings of some of these financial measures of risk, value at risk, VAR, and the models of risk used in finance. But it should be noted that such forms represent the repetition at a higher power of the basic reifications of capital. So reification is kind of turning a process into an object, or an object into a process, we could say, for the sake of brevity. So some of that reification returns at a high level through finance. Homogenizing and objectifying particular socially and politically determinate risks as abstract risk. These forms like value at risk, these models, are the financial sphere's cognates of abstract labour in the sphere of production. So again, this is maybe a bit dense, but Marx theorizes abstract labour as the kind of form of labour that capital needs. In other words, labour that's quantifiable. So you can make all kinds of different products, and that will involve all kinds of different labour, skilled or not. But in terms of abstract labour, it's all the same. It's all exchangeable, equivalent. Abstract labour is labour time measured in hours. So the argument here is that these forms like value at risk, these measures of risk, sort of reproduce that same abstraction and the kind of quantification, objectification of labour as a process, but at a higher level. homogenizing and objectifying particular socially and politically determined risks as abstract risk. They're a cognate of that abstract labour in production in the world of finance. Markowitz and his portfolio theory of risk management and the VAR, value at risk measure, depend on this abstraction of risk to automate and autonomize the assessment of specific investments. So again, if in factories we see kind of automation and sort of fine-tuning of production processes so that anyone interchangeably can perform those roles, on the conveyor belt or whatever. In finance, you have a similar process of automation and streamlining, or literally making that process autonomous in a way that it was not previously. So you don't need a stockbroker or somebody who's highly trained to sit and make decisions. You have a measure of risk, you have a model, you have a program that can do that automatically. Markowitz's portfolio theory of risk management and the VAR measure depend on this abstraction of risk to automate and autonomize assessment of specific investments. Once achieved, this becomes an industrial process. Human oversight and investigation of particular investments, particular assets, is displaced by black boxes computing homogenized variables. In fact, people hear more and more about algorithms and high-frequency trading and the forms in which contemporary finance operates. So basically computer-automated exchanges make up like 70% of all of the exchanges in financial trading today. It's all done by algorithms, by programs. These phenomena are not alone sufficient to explain the systemic crisis of capital, however. The growth of speculative finance is inseparable from the larger process of social reproduction and the productivity of capital as a whole. To put it crudely, the crisis of overproduction and underconsumption arising from massively increasing technical productivity dictates the expanding destruction of both exchange and the use values in order to reproduce the conditions for capital accumulation. So I guess I'm just trying to say, rather than saying finance is the cause of the new level of volatility that emerges from the result of the attempt to counteract volatility, there's actually a kind of deeper cause, where a cause is as deep as finance and as broad as finance, and that's the productivity of labour achieved through increasing technological advances. So we have automation in finance, but we also have automation everywhere else. We have the imposition of measures for controlling and organising labour in ways that maximise efficiency from capital's perspective. On the other hand, there's also a sense in which capital has to sort of smash up the conditions of production that it's already created in order to deal with its own productivity. So that's the next twist in the series of twists, right, in this spiral. If information does not produce as much value as is claimed in those theories about information as value or value becoming information, then not only fictitious claims but also productive assets must be cancelled for accumulation to continue. As fictitious values previously treated as if they were real assets went into freefall during the credit crunch, real capital began to be wiped out along with it. As McNally says, factories are mothballed, corporations go bust and sell off their buildings, machines, land, customers lists and so on at bargain basement prices. This process of destruction is still, or when I was writing this, was still in its early stages, with many forms of financial feedback yet to begin unwinding. But the idea is simply that you hit the systemic crisis, you have a big financial crisis, and sooner or later, actual companies in the real economy, as it's known, start to be affected, right? So jobs are lost and factories shut down, etc., etc. And all of this expresses some underlying crisis of capital, which emerges from its very productivity, from its very ability to produce more and more and more with less and less work, less and less labour. Here we see the real signature of cybernetic capitalism, not infinite growth through deregulated feedback, but rather an intensified and expanding destruction of value. So this value destruction, the loss of jobs, the loss of factories, even the destruction of commodities. People can't afford to buy commodities anymore because they're not earning a wage. That's part of destroying a whole heap of claims on value, a whole fictitious capital sort of mountain. This destruction of value is a result of crisis, and it's a necessary part of the kind of feedback loop of capital. So that's the signature of cybernetic capitalism. We talk about it as a form of increasing control, increasing order through chaos, order through the kind of use of disorder and noise. But it's actually part of a kind of expanding value destruction process. And it's kind of not a perspective that will emerge if you approach cybernetics in the normal ways. If you're familiar with some of the contemporary discussion, theorists, people will cite theorists like Foucault, they'll talk about biopower, and they'll talk about forms of surveillance and control society. But what I'm saying is that there's something even more, arguably pernicious going on here, which is this massive destruction of value that includes, both massive amounts of infrastructural capital, but also people, right? People are capital in a capitalist society. So that's the signature of cybernetic capitalism, not infinite growth through deregulated feedback, but an intensified and expanding destruction of value and claims on value. The zero growth ideology, which people may have heard about, first was enunciated in a report called The Limits to Growth, published by a group of MIT cyberneticians and commissioned by the capitalist think tank, the Club of Rome, back in 1972. So, same moment at which the dollar ceases to be backed by gold and hence by labour, capitalist think tanks start to think about ways in which to limit consumption and to control growth as it's understood in capitalist terms. From this set of scenarios for capitalist sustainability, right, capital starts to worry in the early 70s about how things can carry on. From this set of scenarios, published at the very moment the dollar was being decoupled from gold, to Thatcher-era deindustrialization and privatization, the feedback loops of finance have been intimately linked to the driving down of social reproduction, and that means simply the sustenance of humans, infrastructure, and environment. And this is taking place at a global level, right? So you can point to the explosion of, I've seen millions of laptops, the explosion of apples all over this whatever you call this stage, steps, seats, right? There's an awful lot more computing power, an awful lot more technology, but social reproduction is not simply technology, it's, how are people living, what level are they being reproduced at as parts of capital. And I'm sure I'll come to this, but the rise of slums across the planet since 1970 is one very simple way of visualizing what declining social reproduction and expanding value destruction looks like. Right? So it doesn't mean productivity isn't increasing and that technology isn't advancing, etc., in amazing ways, but there is a parallel process of expanding destruction or diminution of social reproduction. So this whole period is part of restructuring social reproduction. As McNally notes in the same essay, the imposition of the value logics across every sphere of social existence simultaneously reflects unprecedented financial volatility and impels an epochal attack on proletarian reproduction through dismantling of subsidies to subsistence goods, removal of wage protections, welfare, and privatization of public services. All this contributed to the further rise of financialization and, as such, accelerated value destruction. And this kind of accelerated value destruction is visibly the telos, or end, the goal, of cybernetic capital again now, in the kind of unwinding of existing financial feedback loops. So that's the only thing that's really dated in this article, is the idea that all of these financial feedback loops would unwind. In fact, what's happened is that they've accelerated and expanded, right? So we can maybe come back to what's actually going on. But the basic idea that there's a kind of reduction in the level of social reproduction going on, I think holds good. It's just that it happens to coincide with the continuation of the production of fictitious capital, of financial forms like I've been talking about. Massive creation of money, to put it simply. So I don't know if you are familiar with this term quantitative easing, but an awful lot of money has been generated by states issuing bonds right, in order to create cash, basically, that can be used, as it has been used to create yet more claims on those bonds, right? So it hasn't gone into lowering fees in education, it hasn't made our lives better, but it has created even more financial claims on those bonds, on that debt. Anyway, so yeah, now after all that, let's finally get to the music bit, insofar as there's a difference. John Cage, there's poetry as soon as we realise that we possess nothing. What then of culture, not to mention politics, in this by no means completed era of financialisation and cybernetic self-regulation? Long before the rise of derivatives, feedback was being explored as key to new artistic forms and practices. If, as Tikkun claimed, network society is a kind of massive global cybernetic system, and the social cultural structures of feedback, internet, social networks, and workplace monitoring of performance, logistics, meta-finance, and so on, possess distinctive political and economic characteristics, how does culture anticipate, reflect, or resist these? What's the relationship between culture and this massive cybernetic feedback system? We can begin by considering how the cultural and social structures of feedback, like the financial ones, today mesh with capital's major feedback loop. Capital is now compelled by its own logic to destroy an increasing amount of the means of production it commands. It needs to devalue labour power and avoids paying for reproduction of other forms of capital. So today we see expanding forms of non-reproduction, including annexation of labour power outside of the advanced capitalist countries through globalisation, bolstering of profits by paying workers less than the cost of reproduction, the non-maintenance of infrastructure, the non-replacement of natural resources, environment, and so on. Sort of flashing out what I was saying a moment ago. Considered from this perspective, feedback, both financial and cultural, is not just about abstraction. It's not just about control or bureaucracy. Rather, the growth of the network form and the measuring and monitoring of all areas of social existence extends the scope of non-reproduction exponentially. The annexation of free inputs, environmental, infrastructural, and reproductive, is enabled by the network or the network form. At the theoretical level, cybernetics collapses the distinction between man and nature, between states and between states, in the sense of, the UK, subsumed under a universal set of feedback loops, anticipates a unified field of self-regulation and, quote, self-reproduction, as it's been termed, imposed in neoliberal capitalism. So, to put that in a more simple way, cybernetics anticipates a kind of contracting social reproduction. Cybernetics and network forms work with neoliberalism and neoliberal form of capitalism. And they make a kind of theoretical shift, which people celebrate as emancipatory, sort of levelling the subject and the object, placing the subject on the same, all subjects are part of a network, celebrated as democratic and egalitarian. What I'm suggesting is that is also the way in which capital can crack into resources, like environmental, human capital, technology, infrastructure. That levelling is actually very, very dangerous from the perspective of those who, have nothing to lose, as it were. Or something to lose still, maybe to put it better. Anyway, so cybernetics' higher order of abstraction implies an expanded field of increasingly extractive accumulation, in which both waged and unwaged labour are available. People will perhaps be familiar with the idea of free labour as precondition of the social network. So, everyone knows from their Twitter feed or Facebook that they're continually generating content that's not paid for, that makes a commodity if it's Facebook or Twitter. People will be familiar with that as a precondition. Both fictitious claims, finance and social networks, culture, require free inputs, unpaid labour and unpaid for assets in order to perform. Derivatives performativity as claims on value assumes it commands unpaid and non-reproductive labour. For example, through their effect on the price of commodities and labour in low GDP countries. Network cultural production solicits labour and prosumer activity, and individual capitals are able to reduce their overheads, if not increase their rate of exploitation, by the outsourcing of content production to the end user. Right? So you don't have to pay for part of your production if it's done by the consumer themselves. Paying attention, to coin a phrase, may not create value directly, but clearly the formerly passive consumer has been activated. Both terms, culture and finance, are increasingly interchangeable. Finance is aestheticized as its claims become absurdly fictitious. Culture is reduced to finance as its fictions become absurdly monetized. So, I mean, you know, starting to get towards culture finally. I'd like to suggest here that the rise of such a culture of free inputs and financial feedback is anticipated and prepared, if not foreseen or desired, which is a different thing, in the neo-avant-garde of the 50s and after. So we're back to John Cage almost. Seeing feedback as a route to a more autonomous and egalitarian cultural and social existence, a way of dissolving the hierarchical structures of a bureaucratized mass society. The pioneers of cybernetic and network culture generally failed to target the form of feedback, that is value, or the value form per se. So, I mean, just a lot of these sentences strike me as being written the wrong way around. What it should be saying is, you know, in the Cold War, cybernetic feedback seemed like a really good idea, and emancipating and activating the listener or the viewer seemed like a really democratic and anti-hierarchical aesthetic move. So yeah, you can see in the context of a polarized, hierarchized, bureaucratic social order, there was a kind of organic and understandable sort of attraction to models that would kind of level the playing field between subject and object, between the producer and the consumer, etc., or the audience and the artist. But so I'm saying this is great, but it obviously doesn't nail or target value as such in the Marxian sense, the value form, i.e. a society that's not just bureaucratic and hierarchical, but also organized around the accumulation of value, right? We can come back to that if it's opaque. But so both counter and corporate culture converged on a more liberated, technocratically enlightened form of circulation and reproduction, which ironically presupposed the deregulation of money and the looting of those subject to the diktats of decommodified wealth. So again, I'm sort of jumping ahead, but the idea here is that both the counterculture, you know, the hippies, the kind of critical, anti-Fordist, anti-Cold War sort of cultural avant-garde, neo-avant-garde, in some ways converge with the corporations in their interest in a kind of more democratic and technocratically enlightened form of circulation. So, you know, both artists making their products and corporations making their products wanted to get the products to the consumer in new ways. So John Cage's ethos here is what I'm going to use as a kind of shorthand in a way, or an embodiment of this sort of complex. John Cage's ethos of impersonality in artistic production shares, by no means accidentally, something of cybernetics' flattening of the man/nature or organism-environment distinction. Conceived as an aesthetics of Buddhist self-abdication, the shift from subjective intention to aleatory or chance processes has structural similarities to the outsourcing of evaluation and decision, later seen in black box trading in finance and other forms of financial feedback. So this is the big claim in a way, right? Here is that the aesthetic use of chance operations and randomness parallels and anticipates what happens in finance, but we'll go into it in more detail. Rather than creating finished works, the post-cybernetic artist or composer becomes a programmer of cultural software, setting up self-regulating, ideally self-executing systems or processes. So you see in this kind of post-Cagean aesthetic, huge emphasis on process. We could talk about similar developments in painting, obviously. But yeah, let's stick to blaming John Cage. From Lamont Young to Philip Glass, Sol LeWitt to Hans Hacker, you know, so a bit of swerving there between music and fine art. The implications of processual feedback as form are manifold, but an overall shift in orientation is apparent. The Duchampian ready-made, the ultimate or rather foundational license to lose, already implicit in Fordist artistic production, becomes for itself with the post-Cagean phenomenologists of feedback. So again, I'm referencing a lot of things all at once. Duchamp's ready-made, which will be familiar, can be seen as a kind of originary moment in this shift to kind of aesthetics of free inputs. Cage makes the audience in a Duchampian way, makes the audience into producers with his score, 4 minutes 33 seconds. Everyone will know this work, I guess. 4 minutes 33 begins with a single sort of gesture followed by no musical production in the conventional sense, but framing whatever noises are or are not taking place. So yeah, with this kind of move, with this score, Cage makes the audience into producers. His own production being confined to minimal instructional score. Lamont Young, another sort of post-Cagean composer, seeks ways to let the untreated raw sonic material resonate without intervention. He says, we must let the sounds be what they are. Rather than working on the world in instrumental fashion to shape it, we must find ways to give it back its independence and listen to it better. This may be a higher level reskilling of the de-skilled listener, set free from the traditional interpretive duties, but it could also be read as a miniature manifesto of non-reproduction. I'm not sure if I'm going to explain that here, but if you imagine that instrumental work, instrumental labour, would traditionally be seen as necessary, both in terms of producing stuff in general, but producing art. There's a kind of radical abstention or refusal of work even in this aesthetic. So just let the sounds be what they are. And Lamont Young is behind the kind of the popularization, or maybe even the pioneering work in drones, like musical drones, which then gets picked up in pop music through the Velvet Underground and just returns everywhere, all the way down to techno, contemporary forms, or if you listen to contemporary artistic musical production. This kind of notion that it's not about the virtuosity and the labour and the work done by the artist as composer or performer, but rather by listening to the sound, letting the object speak, is clearly, has wide-ranging significance and influence. So I'm just trying to say that, in a way, this kind of, rather than working on the world in an instrumental fashion to shape it, we must find ways to give it back its independence, to listen better. This may be a high level reskilling, but it's also non-reproduction, because one is not having to reproduce those musical skills, the techniques, the kind of techniques of listening, for that matter. So it's democratizing, because anyone can listen to a drone. It's not colonized by culture in the way that a Beethoven sonata is, maybe. But on the other hand, it also would represent a massive sort of de-skilling, and here I'm suggesting there's a kind of isomorphism or a parallel between what happens in the rest of production and these kind of artistic, non-interventional, anti-instrumental aesthetics. The composer's non-work shifts from the creation of teleological musical narrative to a narrative with a kind of beginning, middle, and end, that's goal-driven sort of structure, to the precipitation and harvesting of psychoacoustic free inputs. So letting the sound be would be, like I say, a formula of non-reproduction, in that you don't do any work to it, you don't expand on it, you don't refine it or rework it. It's a free input because it's there already. So if I say 4 minutes 33 beginning now, that's just there, that's you. That's a room, that's a free input. These are catalyzed by the creation within interacting streams of sound data, or virtual or gestalt musical lines. So the idea that you set off a number of musical lines simultaneously, and it amounts to something greater than the sum of its parts, a gestalt. Lamont Young speaks of combination tones. Steve Reich, who might be familiar to people here, speaks of resulting patterns. So you set up a number of patterns played on whatever instrument and let them run, and gradually unprogrammed, pre-programmed patterns emerge. Sonic effects that have not been sort of paid for, as it were, in terms of conceptual process, in terms of scoring or planning, are just there, and that's something for free, as it were. Philip Glass, whose additive compositional process eschews a goal-directed temporality, or offers, quote, recombinant teleologies, discovered a similar unplanned qualitative plus, kind of added value, while listening to a performance of one of his works in a concert hall, deciding to consciously incorporate such psychoacoustic effects in future works. Unplanned outputs become new inputs within an infinite responsive musical feedback process. Notoriously, musical minimalism synced opposing temporalities to a single pulse. In the process, becoming crossover music. It became very popular. There is a market for minimalism, which there probably is not for Schoenberg. As in financial derivatives, which align existing revenue streams to produce more than the sum of their parts, it is enough to bring two repeating musical patterns into coordination to produce a virtual third. The temporality of the derivative is also anticipated in the split or schizoid time of minimalist composition, in which ceaseless activity at the molecular level produces stasis and stability on a macro scale, simultaneous acceleration and deceleration. So, this is a little bit longer, I hope, yeah? Okay, it's only a couple of pages. Both financialization and minimalism can be described as, quote, machines for the suppression of historical time, a phrase from Levi-Strauss, and with some justice have been criticized as exhibiting the positivist or mystic drive to master and suspend temporal succession, to preempt and overcome history by application of self-correcting models. You can see that in finance, right? You can see how finance needs to master time with these things like derivatives, contracts. Stockhausen is overtly anti-historical in his pronouncements on his aesthetic, although I think he's a lot more interesting than some of the other the classical minimalist composers such as Glass and Reich, who seem to want to tap into a secular eternity that mirrors the reticulated flow of advertising and TV. And I don't know if people know, my legs are. People know Terry Riley or Steve Reich or Philip Glass or any of these minimalist composers, but a lot of them, if you read their stuff back in the 60s, are sort of saying, the Vietnam War is happening and it's terrible, let's just stop history. All we do is destroy each other. Let's stop time. So this kind of modal, cycling, repetitive, sort of, hypnotic music is, in a way, evoking a sort of temporality that isn't about progress and development and teleology, goals, right? Kind of Fordist and classical capitalist sort of virtues, Victorian virtues, you might say. Instead, it's like open-ended, it's not directed, it could go anywhere, it's interested in indeterminacy, randomness, and that's seen as liberating. So I guess to continue the enormous downer that I'm suggesting, right? But that's very nice, but stopping history within history could be problematic, right? We have to ask ourselves who wins when one assumes a kind of suspension of history. And I guess my argument here is that finance is the capitalist form of a suspension of history, right? It suspends its crisis by stopping time. And that's what things like derivatives and financial instruments achieve. Musical feedback can signify as a dream of perpetual motion, as growth without excess, as a regained cosmic balance, like as in Riley or Lamont Young or Cage. Whatever the ideological orientation or intentions of the individual composers, many aspects of systems influence music, minimalist, repetitive music, seem to dream capital's subsequent involutions as a utopian exit from it. So I'm saying they anticipate where capital goes in the neoliberal period in this music of the 60s and 70s. Now, beyond that, but that's when it's innovated. The creation of musical feedback loops yields a form of sonic, sometimes spiritual, added value that is attributable to neither composer nor performers, but depends on their environment, the concert hall or studio, and the reverberations released or captured by the unfolding musical material. So it's a kind of aesthetic gift economy, which nevertheless echoes the larger restructuring of production and contraction of social reproduction, in which such cultural forms are discovered and developed. You can call this analysis unmediated adjacency. It's a term Adorno used to slag off Benjamin. But downtown New York minimalism was certainly born somewhere between Madison Avenue and Wall Street. The suspension of dollar gold convertibility and of linear musical development in minimalism occur at the same point on the historical score, as does bankruptcy and then gentrification of New York. So I don't know if I go into this, but Philip Glass was driving a cab famously before he became famous. And these people were literally inhabiting these spaces in former warehouses and rundown factories that would become gentrified and immensely expensive once the city was financialized after 1970. So this minimalist aesthetic, this aesthetic of repetition, this systems-based cybernetic music, was literally made in the kind of interstices of these two modes of accumulation. Fordist, post-Fordist, whatever you like to call it. So whatever one makes of this brief exercise in cultural economic isomorphism, it does seem worth urgently asserting the currency, or rather bankruptcy, of certain post-cybernetic conceptions of culture. An ethos of self-limited and self-sustaining activity, freed from the hubris of modernist teleologies of growth, linked to a notion of generosity, gift economy, DIY emancipation, etc., all still seem appealing, right? These all still have currency. Yet, however militant the refusal of instrumental reason, linear time, progression, etc., this ethos predominantly operates by bracketing out the dull compulsion of the value form. This leaves it hostage to the kind of reappropriation now being conducted by the capitalism of the big society. So famously, David Cameron's vision of a self-managed or DIY social reproduction post-crisis, right? We all have to run our own hospitals, schools, you name it, perform your own operation. So this leaves it hostage. In many countercultural products and processes, the commitment to dissolution of the work, of the artwork, into the flow of negative feedback and free-floating non-consumerist desire, right? Because it is seen as a way of getting out the product, the commodity, the ego. This dissolution coexists with a project for the creation or replication of enclaves or islands outside the sphere of consumerism or capitalism, conceived as a bureaucratic regime of unfettered development. If you think capitalism is bureaucracy, then a zone of relative autonomy, a temporary autonomous zone, a state of anarchic self-elaboration could be seen as outside capital. Today we see the reductio ad immiseration of this larger trajectory into an ethics of doing more with less. Reference to Wire season 5. So what happens to the news media, what happens to policing in Baltimore? Doing more with less. Everyone has to find ways to work with a diminished budget. Architects and theorists such as Rem Koolhaas and artists such as Marjeta Potric, to name but one of many, encourage us to embrace the self-organizing, self-regulating creativity and improvisation of the entrepreneurial slum dweller, hymning the efficiencies of outsourcing former state services to the absolutely destitute. Policy wonks such as Charles Leadbeater from Demos, Demos, eulogize the mendicant refuse collectors of Recife, Brazil, so homeless guys and women, with their supermarket trolleys and contract-free labour. That, they talk about how this is much more efficient than having a state-administered refuse collection system. Network creativity can be read as a euphemism for the harvesting of these kind of free inputs, which the eulogists assume will add up to sufficient savings and value creation to keep the financialized system in motion. So in short, a system that's ruled by these expanding bubbles of fictitious capital, these claims on value, these informational, algorithmic forms of capital, at the base imposes more and more reproductive work unpaid on the majority of the population. All this is a consummation of the cybernetic capitalist tendency to activate potential by removing means of support and subsistence, letting the raw human materials resonate to the newly opened up environment of non-reproduction. Right? Let the sounds be what they are. The dead hand of the state or overarching structure of welfare and services is withdrawn to facilitate the free play of the system's molecular constituents. Capitalism as open system is increasingly dependent on the annexation of the outside in all its forms. And where this outside is definitively assimilated, it must be recreated endogenously by the subtraction of existing social reproduction. So you can create your own outside and your own outside art. We could look around us, these processes sort of coexist. Rather than recycling forms of cultural feedback developed more or less consciously as a subversion of the Fordist, statist, bureaucratic social order in the 50s and 60s, a project that was, as I say, always ambivalent in its implications for the majority of the population. Perhaps we should shift our focus, right? Let's not look back to the good cybernetics or the good countercultural forms of the 60s, of the Cold War, etc., of the counterculture. Perhaps we should shift our focus culturally and politically to the ways financial feedback has laid the ground for today's era of struggles around subsistence, in a society subsumed under an ever more volatile value form. As an expanding global proletariat confronts contracting social reproduction, the question of the cultural producers is whether one solely serves an extended program of value destruction, or at least tries to contest it, right, in some artistic way, political way, but in some way. Revolts catalyzed by Twitter and Facebook, thinking back to the Arab Spring here, which it wasn't so long ago when I read this, but now it seems a long time ago. Revolts catalyzed by these social media, alongside the offline networking of all those put into contact with and forced ever closer to slavery by financialized systems, are the positive feedback loops beginning to resonate after years of controlled deregulations and informatization. Right? So if negative feedback is finance growing and social reproduction contracting, positive feedback, from my perspective at least, would be the forms of riot and disorder and challenge to those kind of loops that started to emerge around, well, after 2008 and right through to the 2012, we might say, still ongoing perhaps. The accelerating repetition of ineffective financial moves generates an ever greater financial contradiction, which is transposed across the social scale, from banks to states to populations. As subsidies are withdrawn, barriers to capital dismantled, this contradiction is translated into food and fuel price inflation, in turn triggering riots and a proletarian music of revolt, ripping through once stable states. With the socialist and now fundamentalist control circuitry torn out, this is from 2011, or severely compromised by financialized capital, perhaps an unregulatable feedback will ensue, right? So this is the closing communist sort of fanfare for this article, which clearly hasn't happened. Yeah, feedback's cool as long as you do it hard enough and far enough that the state actually does undo itself. The argument here is not let us return to cybernetics and redo the aesthetics of the 60s and 70s, but rather how do we push things into overdrive, what place has art in that, how does it relate to the actual social movements that are in a way doing this, right? There are forms of positive feedback. An unprecedented coordination of class decomposition and social non-reproduction has made systemic risk in every sense far greater than it has been for decades, greater than in the entire history of capitalism perhaps. If the spiral of feedback leading from financial bubble to insurrectionary wave that now seems possible is fulfilled, then we may yet have to revise our opinion of the long era of financialization. It will have been more than just a fiction of wealth, the imposition of the value form as a volatile but empty claim to value creation. In a final spiral of cyber-capitalist feedback, finance may prove to have been the amplifier par excellence of the noise that abolishes the capitalist signal, that is of the signal which is value, the one supremely abstract, supremely material thing that it always must communicate, send and receive. An exponential positive feedback in class struggle should not be assumed, however, any more than the teleological projections of cybernetics. So, for example, inevitable planetary death by overpopulation was one of the early 70s kind of projections of cyberneticians back in that Club of Rome report. That hasn't happened yet. One would have to be more myopic than a risk analyst or Middle Eastern CIA operative to miss the current potential for the destructive cycle of financial feedback to invert into an unprecedented global cycle of struggles against capital per se. But one would have to be less pessimistic than, I don't know, Bill Gates to say that, yeah, that hasn't happened exactly. So, I mean, just to close, for me what's missing here is further reflection on cultural form, without getting into the politics of, will capital generate a big enough crisis to cause itself systemic problems again, or what opportunities are there for people in the majority of humanity in this kind of feedback. I'd rather kind of focus on the aesthetic politics here, because it's implied that all of these forms are not useful as aesthetic politics, right? They're either adverts for or prototypes for things like the big society, for austerity, or for a self-managed lowering of the level of social reproduction, or at best it becomes a kind of middle class, organic, sort of a holistic aesthetic So you could see minimalism, Cage, etc., rehearsing a certain sort of notion of harmony, which is very nice if you can afford it, but doesn't go that far. Like most people don't get to enjoy that condition. Or maybe to be a bit more nuanced or a bit more fine-grained, we could say that aesthetics that prioritize the open work, open-endedness, randomness, stochastics or methods, all of them are sort of anti-commodity, anti-product aesthetics that privilege process. So I'd say that maybe at the very least we have to problematize that, and it's no longer enough to just kind of rehearse those sort of experiments, like I say, of this period, and sort of hold them up as models, or as either models for social process or models for artistic production. So let's reconsider the virtues of determination, of decision, the kind of responsibilities of authorship, of emotion, anger, engagement, thought, mapping, understanding what's going on. What if you want to make work that doesn't think you can stop time, suspend history, and float off into kind of self-contained, self-reference? But what if you want to make work that speaks to people, challenges what's going on, invokes reflection, change, etc.? I just think that's probably what's really at stake in this discussion, for us anyway, in this room. It's kind of like, how much can we retrieve from the legacy of people like Cage in the wake of the kind of financialization of everything and the financialization of art, and how much do we have to kind of start again, or so I put that as a kind of question to you and to me and to Mike above all. No. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think what I particularly appreciate is that sense of, you brought of revisiting this material, and that sense of the contemporaneity of it, but also the sense of thinking through the nuances and even what's changed in the last couple of years. I mean, I guess maybe I can lead off just by asking, there's kind of two maybe related questions. So the first one would be, you used the phrase anticipation several times, and one of the questions that I would have would be what felt maybe was not articulated was what you feel the relationship is between art and culture and society at large. What does it mean for these processes to have prefigured capital? Developments in financial capital. What is that? What is the relationship between John Cage and what's happening in Wall Street now? Why is this a kind of a...
I put coffee on my glasses as an anti-reproductive measure. Non-reproductive. So I can't see you. Yeah, go on.
No, in a sense that was the first question, was just about what, in a sense, what's your model of art practice? How does art either prefigure or, if we're talking, for example, about feedback processes, what is the nature of the feedback process between acts of cultural intervention and a wider political context, for example? So to think through, that rather than a kind of simple relationship by which art prefigures financial capital, for example, is it possible to think that through a model of related feedback, for example? The second question would just be, we mentioned at the beginning that you're revisiting this material in terms of something operatic. I'm just really curious to know if you could talk a little bit, you talked at the end about what a contemporary art practice might be that spoke back in a different way. It would be great just to hear more about that, what your sense of investment.
All right. So first off, sort of what's the relation to this kind of cultural intervention, things like finance, or what's the model you have for the relationship between culture and developments in finance and capital, if it's not just kind of temporal succession. I mean, I guess here, this emerged as research from me wanting to sort of give a form to what was then my kind of PhD thesis research. So I was kind of trying to explore the proposition that cultural form is analogous to isomorphic with finance. So it started by looking at the present, right? If you looked at a contemporary movie or contemporary advert, Frederick Jameson does this in his essay on finance, capital, and cultural form. He finds a kind of reflexivity, recursiveness, autonomy in contemporary cultural form, and says this is like finance. And it's not kind of clear there which comes first, or whether. I guess the dominant sense in that kind of analysis is that it's all part of one synchronic system. It's definitely seen by people like Jameson as symptomatic, as a sign of this increasing reification, this increasing commodification of culture. So it's not necessarily a good thing, and it's clearly seen to relate to the rise of a kind of capitalism that doesn't invest in production as it once did. It invests in finance, but he treats it as a kind of, like I say, synchronic, simultaneous thing. I was trying to do a kind of history of that, or genealogy, prehistory of that situation, and that's what led me to start looking at the music. And to be honest, I kind of took my whole. I just had this idea that it would be interesting to approach it like an earlier diagnosis of the same problem. So, like Thomas Mann in his novel Dr. Faustus takes Schoenberg and treats him as the kind of precursor in some ways of the Nazis, right? So it's the idea that modernism as an aesthetic technique, cultural form, literally is bound up with and simultaneously prefigures and parallels the rise of this kind of totalitarian, irrational form of capitalism. So I said, well, what if you took that narrative and redid it for neoliberalism? What would it look like? Like ending with 2008. And that kind of led me to go, okay, well, the origin then would be people like the post-Keynesian composers, because in the name of a critique of capital and of the bourgeois cultural form, just as with Schoenberg, you develop these forms of non-teleological, non-dominative, less controlling, freer, random, and I never say it in this piece, but outsourced production, right? The idea that you let the sounds be themselves, let things produce for you, and you kind of automate production in a sense. All of those well-intentioned, anti-disciplinary, anti-repressive, anti-capital sort of aesthetic moves do then become taken up in the cutting edge of finance capital, or the cutting edge of capitalist organisation. So it just kind of, it was a bit like going, how did we get to the condition that's being described by people like Jameson? And maybe emphasising the extent to which that's about a kind of accumulation. I think the theorists hadn't in the 80s and 90s, and when people were beginning, hardly anyone tried to write about this, as far as I know. And when they did, they didn't have I think their model of capitalist accumulation was a bit one-sided. It was still about acceleration and abstraction and dematerialization, but not enough about this kind of looting process that I'm touching on here. So it's like, yeah, how do you periodize that kind of cultural form? And so using that narrative exploring that narrative led me to look at the composers of that period. And I actually ended up reading Wim Mertens, who's like a really interesting, I think, 80s post-minimalist composer from Belgium. And he wrote an amazing book analysing minimalist music, and he starts as a huge fan, and he talks about all the ways in which it's this kind of Deleuzian critique of linearity and of domination and narratives of progress and development, all the classical bourgeois sonata form style artistic virtues. But then at the end he says it's all completely regressive. It's all repetition is regression. And Adorno was right, and just as in the Thomas Mann novel, there's a kind of critique of regression, right? The Nazis are regression, 12 Tone is ultimately part of a larger regression of bourgeois culture. So, yeah, just doing that research led me to see some very different sort of conceptualizations of cultural form. And again, it's a symptom as well as a precursor. So there is a feedback loop in a sense. Does that?
Yeah, I guess that's what you touched on the end of, maybe was what I was getting at. I guess I'm curious about whether it's like a prefigurative symptom, but it's like, I wonder then how much agency this room, for example, as artists, how much agency, and maybe this leads on to that question of your own work. I mean, what is the nature of agency? If work ends up, as it were, inevitably, despite whatever the kind of explicitly non-capitalist intentions, if it essentially just prefigures new forms of kind of what's the way out?
Well, I mean, I think it's actually really positive to affirm the ways in which all of this ostensibly agentive and critical work ends up being the cutting edge of capital. Right? I mean, this stuff parallels the discussion in left-wing or communist theory around communization, where they basically say, yeah, there really was this amazing movement of self-organization in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it changed capitalism. And now you can't do that anymore. That's no longer revolutionary. But it's important that it happened. So I think the thing is not to say, oh, well, nothing works, what's the point? That's not the conclusion. The conclusion is to radicalize the situation you're in, and to do what's now possible that never was before. So you don't make art that celebrates the values of self-organization and DIY and contingency and randomness, because capital loves that. And that's what I was trying to say about, for example, celebrating self-organized rubbish collection in the developing or former developing world. Right? We can't do that, and we can't here in South London, in Peckham, in Hackney, we can't make art that celebrates the big society-compatible virtues of, like I say, DIY reproduction. So I'd say that this mapping process that I think that artwork does, or this opera film thing that I'll be doing does, and other things that I do, other people do, I think it's useful because it's negative, right? It draws the conclusions about the situation as hard as possible in ways that will confront people with what's going on. So that's very positive in its negativity. I do think sort of saying art can't be a model for social reproduction in this era is a very positive negative, right? So I can expand on that, but if it makes any sense.
Hey, I thought it was actually, Brian thought it was very interesting, kind of connecting what we would look at as classic minimalist composition with kind of sort of middle class concerns, especially because every fan of Philip Glass now is very white middle class suburban mothers primarily. So I'm interested about you talking about this sort of anti-historical freedom that the mid-century was trying to kind of put about, and how that's actually incredibly violent because of one of that subjectivity, that it takes a very kind of decentralized, it takes a very centralized subjectivity to be able to put into fruition. And I was thinking about, I guess, this sort of anti-historicism versus this sort of anti-futurity, this push anti-futurity, and I'm taking that directly from queer theorists of the last decade or so, and I want to know exactly how, in other ways, you think that this sort of anti-futurist kind of, I guess, end of the world aesthetic really ties back into the mid-century. I mean, I know a little bit with Stockhausen and his romanticism, especially in his later operas, but yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, to be honest, this is why I would also like to make this whole thing more fine-grained, because it's one thing to go Terry Riley, Steve Reich, Stockhausen, they're all the same. They're all just rehearsing the next generation of capital accumulation's paradigm. It's I do think that they are, but I also think they're really different, and aesthetically different things happen. And I think when Stockhausen's being timeless and anti-historical, it's kind of explosive and amazing often. As sometimes it's kind of hippie sort of, which is that piece of the kind of, it's throat singing, the drone Sometimes it can sound quite innocuous, but other times it's amazing. And I rarely feel like that about Glass or Reich or, Riley. I just don't think that, and I think it's to do with the sense of time in the works themselves, right? So you'd have to get into the actual texture of those artworks, because that explosiveness and that sort of volatility, right, to use that term again, in things like Stockhausen, is really powerful, despite his own conscious ideological commitment to a lot of mystical bullshit, right? So we have to see that things are more complicated, and to be honest, this is a very overview-y, hey, here's an idea, what do you think of this? It's just state it all away, And then, I mean, generally people go, look, what are you talking about? Cage is a really nice guy. How could you say all those horrible things? And I get that. And you know, even Adorno really likes lots of Cage. I mean, bits of Cage at least. So we do need a more fine-grained approach to individual works and to the relationship between works and the intentions of composers, etc. But nevertheless, to answer your question, yeah, there is a lot of bourgeois, white, boring, sort of minimalist musical appreciation and music, I think. And there's something about modularity and repetitiveness. And that, you know, I was trying to suggest, and never even once say it, but every single film you see about finance uses kind of these serial style loops on it, right? I mean, every single one is, if you watch Margin Call or something, or What Was Too Big to Fail, or any of them, it's always the default thing for the movement of money is this kind of minimalist, repetitive, aesthetic, arpeggios, etc., etc. And I don't think it's an accident. There was an FT article about 5 years ago on a composer who was precisely going to do a score about the financial crisis, in which before the crisis was done in minimalist style. The crisis erupts as a kind of 12-tone explosion, like the return of the repressed, the return of like tension, dissonance. So, you know, I think there's something to be said for the idea that artworks in themselves can sort of contain and contest these larger processes, right? They can either go with it smoothly or they can sort of go against the grain. In terms of anti-futurist or non-reproductive, well, that term is the anti-reproductive futurism, right? Or non...
Yeah, it's like non-reproductive futurism.
Yeah.
It's like Lee Edelman.
Lee Edelman, yeah. I'm very sympathetic to that. It's like, I mean, I've got to say it's ironic because I use non-reproduction as a term to denote, you know, bad things, right? From Marx's perspective, the non-reproduction of capital, whether that's people, things, environment, infrastructure, is generally a bad thing, but of course there's one sense in which it's very good, like a complete non-reproduction of capital is exactly what one wants. You know, that's communism. The non-reproduction of the relation, which is capital. Capital is a social relation in the end. And I think the sort of Edelman vision is really bound up with that, i.e. challenging the ostensible goal, futurist-oriented goal of heterosexual reproduction is very important in a society that's making it harder and harder for people who are not fulfilling that project, as well as many of those who are attempting to fulfill that project, right? I mean, everyone's getting it, like the family and the non-family, but of course it's those that don't fit in with that script that still, I think, right, even in the most, across globally, let's say, you're still in a more exposed position. You're exposed to the violence of capital more. And I totally would agree, you know, with the kind of critique of a reproductive futurism that someone like Edelman is making, because it's actually a critique of non-reproduction, right? And so it's tricky, right? The critique of non-reproduction implies a critique of production as well. But it's just that in this era, as I'm trying to say in this paper, capital has to destroy more and more value just to reproduce itself. So it's dialectical, right? It has, in order to go on, it has to speed itself up, which means us. And yeah, you know, that is felt disproportionately by women and, you know, minorities, etc. So it's like we need to, that would be a good example of things that we don't want to let go, right? You don't want to let go of the critique of reproductive futurism. Sorry, yeah, that's about it.
Thank you.
More questions or comments?
Could you repeat the title of the book you were talking about, the minimalist book?
The one I just mentioned in response to mine, yeah? So
Yes.
The Wim Mertens book. Yeah, it's by Wim Mertens or Mertens. It's
Okay.
Mertens, maybe. WIMMERTENS. And I think the book's just called Repetitive Music. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it might have been published under different titles, but minimalist. If you Google that and Google minimalism, you'll definitely find it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I just had a quick question. You used the word gentrification in the later part of your talk, and it does seem a little bit like artists do inhabit spaces or even create spaces which then are gentrified, which is almost like a kind of capitalist production set, right? But then doesn't that also sort of represent capitalism as this kind of ever-adapting form, which then we are creating space for, which I think is kind of what you're sort of saying. So really, is there any way out of that kind of sort of interior view of it almost?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, it's not fleshed out, but in a way I'm sort of taking the example of these composers as just avant-garde or early exponents of what we all are/do as artists or people in some kind of culture sector work. Right? We are all part of that gentrification process, and that's a bit like going back to the moment, like the origins, because those ex-factories were cold water flats, lived in by these people like Josie Pussies. I mean, it's a moment when you can see things clearly. Perhaps that's another reason for doing that, right? Why do a story based in that situation rather than contemporary Hackney or Peckham or something? Well, I don't think you can get outside of it as an artist. That's what I mean about drawing the conclusions and being as negative as possible. In a sense, I think one of the illusions that we might be cured of is the idea that artists say, or a counterculture, because in the end those two things go together in that period. The idea that that can negate capital, or it can create an island, a space, a utopia outside of it. We've seen gentrification just perpetually gives a lie to that idea. Right? The temporary autonomous zone is the neoliberal form of accumulation. It is what capital creates itself. On the other hand, okay, it's antagonistic. It's driven by a desire to create autonomy, to get some space outside of capital's pressures, and that's still a valid impulse. But I just think as a global project, it looks harder to imagine some kind of process whereby little by little all those, Minter, Williamsburg, the right bit of Lagos, they all come together and create one sort of celestial network. That's clearly something we can dispense with, and therefore I think the lesson is that it shifts, not in art but in life and politics. It shifts a sense of the majority as being where it's at. And that's the other thing that I'm trying to bring out at the end of that paper is that, people are on the streets all over the world because of finance pushing everyone on the streets all over the world, right? And that's the most effective system ever developed for creating the conditions for revolution, arguably. So it's a very optimistic view. You could say things have just never been so screwed. But nevertheless, it displaces us from thinking that artists are the crucial leverage point. And I think a lot of, like I say, communization theory and poets and artists inspired by communization theory often act as though there's absolutely nothing for artists to do or say. I don't agree with that either, right? That seems bizarrely disingenuous or self-abnegating thing for someone to stand up in front of a room and say, or make a poem saying. So clearly I do think there's something artists can do within these situations, but it's going to be part of a larger group that isn't defined as artists or cultural producers. And that's something we can talk about in art as well. But I hope that answers a bit.
Sorry.
Not again.
Someone else is asking questions. There's something that Slavoj Žižek talks about a lot when he talks about post-apocalyptic kind of aesthetics, basically, in films. Like, a good example is I Am Legend, where Will Smith kind of trundles down a road where there's loads of, plants coming out of the ground and the buildings are kind of falling down a bit. Happens a bit in Planet of the Apes as well, which is good. But he sort of says that that's the kind of representation we have of a world beyond capitalism. Like, there is no way out of it, in a sense, and so we only imagine ourselves into basically flying into a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And it just seems that is a kind of negative way of thinking of it. It's more like you should speculate more beyond that kind of idea that everything is going to just fall apart as soon as capitalism disappears.
This is what Mark Fisher, who channels Zizek, often would say, no doubt, that it's all part of this capitalist realism and the shutdown of any sense of alternatives, and those films are just running propaganda for the blackmail, either capitalism or things worse than they are now. And I guess, like I say, communization theory takes a similar position, I guess, of embracing what Evan Calder Williams would call socialism and or barbarism. So, you know, yes, things are going to get messy if we really challenge capital, just deal with it. And, you know, he'd then say, I'm a diabetic, so I'm not joking, this isn't going to be funny, but I'm still on for revolution. So you could just say, I mean, I tend to read those films as symptomatic of exactly the post-1971 condition of expanding non-reproduction that I talk about a bit here. And the other part of my PhD, abandoned non-reproduced PhD thesis, was precisely those movies, right, from Soylent Green, a kind of film about cannibalization, down to things like Legend, or you name it, right? Almost all contemporary sci-fi has some variant on that post-apocalyptic scenario going on. And it just seems like that's where we are, right? That's not so much where we're going as how capital conceives the present moment. So, you know, this other film that I've just finished, that I hope to get shown in the next few months, does make a lot of reference to the kind of Blade Runner style trope of advanced technology, but kind of social retrogression or forms of anachronism, right? The coexistence of different periods as the kind of, you know, that's like the signature, the time signature of the era. So I don't see it so much as a negative, propagandistic sort of image of how we can't imagine another world. I see it, or at least as much I see it as an image of how the world is, right? Divided up between super high tech, highly developed finance, and increasing zones that just are not reproduced. So, you know what I mean? The slums, the massive explosion of slums across the planet gives you a world where there's plenty of like rubble and detritus and tumbleweed kicking around alongside super high technology. Just combined in uneven or contradictory conditions.
Hi.
Hello.
I really enjoyed your the analogy you drew between the minimalist and financial workings, but does that also kind of depend on how we're looking at that art form? Like, I wonder, like, what you think of how Reich went to Africa and learned about like he was really influenced by the, I guess, drum circles in Africa. So, like, could we recuperate some kind of reproductive cycle that is not a spiral, but is like taking something from the earth and then putting it back, like a healthier cycle? Like, is that something you could also take out of that form of music?
I mean, I guess that's what it wants you to take, and that's the official story. I was looking at my notes earlier, and I did look into how I think Glass went to India and Reich went to Africa, and my note just says maybe that's why it starts in this shit. You know, it's not as bad as Glass. I just think the answer to that question, the answer to that is that everybody got into African guitar music in the last 10 years in gentrified areas of Britain that were, and America, etc., where you had more and more Africans living. Like where I live, all my neighbours are African, and you can hear some of this music sometimes played by those people or listened to by those people. So there's a sense in which it's not so much getting back to the earth, it's getting back to the current state of capitalism and touching base with the reality that we are close to Africa. That's also a bad thing, right? We were the Tory government definitely wants us to get closer to Africa in one very obvious sense, right? It doesn't want migrants or foreigners, but it does really want you to live at a lower level, right? I think, right? When I say it wants it, it doesn't actually consciously say how can we get it like that, how can we get everyone to hate us more, but that is a result of destroying social reproduction, right? So Africa remains like a really politically, socially, economically loaded utopian index. But I still think you're right, that there's something in this music that aspires to a different and better world. I just think Wright's a kind of social democrat and a liberal, so he wants to get there smoothly, on with a sense of memory and a sense of what we've been through, and some kind of struggle. But it's just a bit more. I don't think he's apocalyptic enough for the capitalism that emerges, perhaps.
Last thing, who was that brought up I Am Legend and like a sci-fi like aesthetic and how it kind of relates to the fall? Oh, hello. Sorry, I didn't see you up there. I was just talking about like a apocalyptic aesthetic. When I look at this one, I always think of like kind of it kind of glorifies as like return to agency, like in all these films, like kind of like the future world falling apart. Like, and this kind of feeling that people have surrounding either like their financial situation or just like his physical mobility, or like they don't feel physically or metaphorically or like in control of themselves, and so there has to be this sort of like why Goldsmiths like running down the hall, like the streets, and there's like why he's like fighting zombies and stuff. It's like very like physical, and I'm wondering like do you think there's like how does that kind of relate to, I guess, like say like disability and like a sort of like anti-disability sort of utopian project that like capitalism sort of gets tied into a little bit, I guess especially in those films. And I remember also thinking like like Avatar and things like that. It was like a sort of a disabled character then becomes like translate. He gets away from the evil government, even military, and then becomes able to walk again through his other body. I don't know, Labrama. No, I was just wondering what everyone thinks of that. If you want to answer.
Yeah, I mean, unless anyone else has got a better answer. I can answer some of that.
All the zombies are communists.
Of course.
Yeah, you say that the breakdown of reification, right, of the normal functioning of society, the normal organisation of things, is an opportunity. Hence, the zombies are communists, the disabled, amidst the kind of, the disabled can act, and when things that normally allow you to act and operate fail, there's a chance for those who are dominated by them to organise, to get together and do something. But I mean, I think this is the lure of the culture of the last 40 years, is that it's always proposing a state of emergency as a state of opportunity. That's what hooks us into the narrative and gives us something to enjoy and to hope for, right? I mean, even the Hunger Games would be a contemporary example. But the trouble is, it's almost like, it's got to a point now where that does, to me, feel often like ideology for the state of things. Not so much a diagnosis, but a kind of, oh right, go on, one last time.
Go on. I think that the second Hunger Games film, where they finally have a revolt, is almost exactly a symptom of how everything about revolution has been imbibed into culture.
And then the third one's even worse, which raises questions. I mean, the second one, it's almost like, it's fake, okay? I mean, it just raises questions about art for me, this whole discussion of these films as symptoms of capitalism, the kind of Zizek, Fisher, etc. thing where people do their politics by proxy through taking positions on box office blockbusters. It's like, let's talk about them as films. Are these any good? Let's get into how they work and how well they work. It's almost like, I think there's a dubious move there in that general tendency of left-wing film criticism to just kind of bracket off the film as such, right? You can see that as non-reproduction itself. The film as theory, stalking horse, or politics. I mean, Mark Fisher makes Hunger Games into revolution. He hates contemporary struggle on the streets. He despises it. He thinks that, people going out and having protests is sad and old-fashioned. But he thinks what's her name, J-Law? It's like, is a revolution. It's like, that strikes me as some form of non-repro socialism. But anyway, that's controversial.
Frederick Bakinson, in his book Archaeologies of the Future, kind of makes an interesting point about how we've kind of been reduced from the ability to have a utopian imaginary just to a utopian fantasy. So how he kind of explains that is that it's like the plot and the character. The imaginary is the plot, and the fancy is the characters. So we just end up in a situation where there's kind of just characters without a plot, And I'm kind of interested in this subject of utopia, and I'm thinking, how do we approach it actually? Because if Jameson is sort of claiming that you have lost this ability for a utopian imaginary, and all we have is just this ability for fancy, which is where do we go? Where do we go? Because a lot of this, how do you approach that?
I think that's which archaeology is of the future.
Archaeology is of the future. Yeah.
I think a lot of that stuff for me reads very much pre-2008, or at least pre-2011, and so it's kind of like he's very much. So I mentioned the Culture and Finance Capital essay from '98. That strikes me as Jameson in the kind of melancholic, but not. I'm not saying he's wrong exactly, but it's very much like in the shadow of the Soviet and then sort of socialist projects of the 20th century. Like the idea of a kind of loss of utopia, the loss of. So, for example, he'll talk about surrealism, and he'll talk about modernism as kind of techniques of the fragment and of kind of shock and rupture, right? So when he's analysing what happens in postmodern culture, it's like all of these techniques returning as kind of devitalised, sort of defanged, sort of form empty signs, or re-narrative. He talks about the re-narrativization of the fragment. So all these things that were once disrupted now come with captions, and they're cliches or stereotypes, so self-referring. And he says that's very much like finance, right? That's how he sees it. So what you just said is a parallel to that diagnosis. And what I would say is that we sort of maybe discover new forms of dissonance and hence social imaginary or utopia, precisely in the breakdown of that kind of financial and cultural nexus. Right? So when 2008 happens and the financial system starts to eat itself a little bit, the cultural system also suffers a kind of shock, there's an opportunity, and something does happen. And we do see people on the streets in new ways, new forms, down to the riots, that I think are utopian. But they're largely not acknowledged by the left or by artists, etc. as such. People might enjoy the frisson, but I don't think sufficiently culture or politics has gone, this is an intimation of a new social possibility. And you can see why, because it's not pretty. It's like Marx says, it's the ugly revolution is what we get after 2008, or we get intimations of that. You get Occupy and the beautiful revolution and community and sharing and self-organisation, which incidentally mirrors and repeats exactly what we've been told we need to do, right? So sacrifice, self-management, self-organisation. That's what they want us to do. Whereas the nasty revolution, right, is there in those riots and is there in these new forms. So I'd say I agree with the diagnosis, but maybe there's something missing in it, or maybe we've just gone further along that spiral since Jameson wrote that diagnosis.
So you're referring with these, let's say, unpleasant revolutions to Croydon, to these parts, let's say the underclass which started to. Who are you referring to?
Yeah, when I said ugly revolution, I was thinking of Marx talking about 1848, and just the contrast with the beautiful revolution and the bourgeois endorsed revolution, which was the symbolic and political, the one that used the forms of civil society, versus the proletarian revolution, the emergence of the proletariat on the stage of history, which was not seen as pretty, right? It was not reproducing the ideology of 1789 as Marx diagnoses that. And I'm saying there's maybe something similar here in 2011 with the riots in the UK. Again, this last year in Ferguson and around the USA, the kind of sort of spontaneous, or so-called spontaneous responses to police violence and murder all over the USA. Those are new forms that show social imaginary, right? The people drawing the conclusions of non-reproduction of a society that cannot offer you a future, etc., for more and more people. So that's what I mean. Like, so the ugly revolution is the point of orientation.
I thought it was interesting from an outsider perspective, because the consequences of this were London buses or travelling around the city with screens showing blown up images of of the rioters, and I just found this sort of, in a sense, it's like a lost opportunity, because the city should have reacted towards this phenomenon of buses, big screens and images of the rioters to find people, to identify them, to report them to the police.
I think they did take advantage of that opportunity. I wouldn't endorse that myself, but definitely. I mean, that would be the next spiral, is that you organise on Facebook and Twitter and you do stuff that gets mediated like that. Then the cops, as we found out in the last 3 years, the NSA has scooped everything that you could possibly say to anyone in advance. So I mean, this is very optimistic, and what I just said is quite optimistic. But we have to keep feeding in, the next spiral of reaction, as it were. And I think it's so deep now that no one can even imagine how bad things are. But I still think that's going to be hopeful. But I don't share the idea that we should grasp on each other more. But any more questions?
We have time for one more of this. Burning to take us out of the death spiral.
Yeah, give us something positive.
Hi. How do you feel about the promise of a Blade Runner 2?
I heard a while back that it was possible. Is it happening?
Harrison Ford, yeah, it's happening.
With Harrison Ford?
Yeah.
With Ridley Scott directing?
I don't think so.
Who can answer a question like that?
You and Mark Fisher, I imagine. You should
Yeah.
have an introduction for the Gala screening.
That's probably how it will be made. It's really tricky. Someone was saying, Jason Reed, who's very interesting on his blog on recent Hollywood film and HBO series, stuff like Breaking Bad, which would be another non-reproduction culture artifact, right? He was saying that all these remakes are bad, except, and then he did a list, and it was kind of John Carpenter's The Thing, and oh God, what else? He had like 2 or 3 instances of remakes in the last 4 years, right? And then I was like, you need to include The Fly, because Cronenberg's Fly is very good, and then people started talking about Douglas Sirk and how a lot of his famous films were also remakes. So, I mean, I don't know. I think even in this era, you can't make a hard and fast rule that all remakes will be bad. Hence my film, which is a remake of La Jetée. Okay.
I think maybe we should end it, but thank you to Ben, and thank you particularly for stepping into the breach at the last minute.
My pleasure, thank you.